The first thing you need to understand about Thomas Whitmore is that he wasn't evil. When he sold his daughter for a bag of grain, he was something far worse, desperate. And desperation in the winter of 1840 in the hills of eastern Kentucky could make even good men do ungodly things. But here's what the historical records won't tell you, what the census takers missed, what even the neighbors who whispered about it for decades never fully understood. Eliza Whitmore didn't disappear after that transaction. She multiplied. The morning it happened started with frost, so thick on the cabin windows that Eliza had to scratch at it with her fingernails just to see outside. She was counting, always counting, the days since they'd eaten meat, 43. The days since her youngest brother stopped crying from hunger, 2. And the days since her mother had spoken a full sentence, 7. The silence from her mother, she would later realize, was the first sign that something had already been decided. Mothers only go that quiet when they're mourning something that hasn't died yet. Thomas Whitmore stood at the door with his hat in his hands, twisting it the way guilty men do when they're about to commit a sin they've already justified to themselves. "Eliza," he said, and his voice cracked like river ice. "Put on your mother's good dress." The fact that he called it her mother's good dress and not her Sunday dress should have told Eliza everything. You don't wear Sunday clothes to meet God, you wear them to meet the devil. The man who came to their cabin that afternoon brought a wagon that creaked like coffin wood and horses that wouldn't look anyone in the eye, not even each other. Josiah Blackwood was his name, though folks in those parts knew him by other names too. The collector, the tradesman, and in whispers that only came out when the moon was new, the keeper. He was 60 if he was a day, with skin like poorly tanned leather and eyes that reflected light like a possum's, even in broad daylight. But the strangest thing about him, and this is what Eliza noticed first, was that snow wouldn't settle on him. It fell all around him, on him, but never stayed. Like even winter itself was afraid to touch him too long. "This her?" Blackwood asked, and when he smiled, Eliza saw he had too many teeth. Not obviously, not like you'd notice right away, but if you counted, and Eliza was always counting, there were 36 teeth in that mouth where there should have been 30. The extra ones were in the back, and they were sharp. Thomas couldn't look at his daughter. Instead, he stared at the bag of grain in Blackwood's wagon like it was salvation itself, and maybe, for the other children, it was. One 14-year-old girl for enough food to keep 5 other children alive through winter. The mathematics of desperation are always simple, even when they're horrible. "She's a good girl," Thomas said, as if he was selling a horse. "Strong, knows her letters, can cook, clean, mend." Each skill he listed was another nail in the coffin of his conscience. But Blackwood wasn't listening to Thomas. He was studying Eliza with those reflecting eyes, and she felt his gaze like cold fingers walking up her spine. "How many winters?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew. 14, Thomas answered. 14, Blackwood repeated, tasting the number. Perfect. The in-between age. Not quite child, not quite woman, not quite innocent, not quite knowing. He reached out one long finger and touched Eliza's cheek. Where he touched, she felt a numbness that would never quite go away, even years later when she could feel nothing else. "Yes, she'll do nicely." The bag of grain hit the frozen ground with a sound like a body fall. 50 pounds of corn and wheat, already showing signs of mold at the corners if you looked close enough, which Thomas Whitmore chose not to do. He grabbed it with both hands and hefted it like he was carrying his own soul to market, which in a way he was. "Take her then," he said, and his voice was already forgetting what it was giving away. That's how the mind protects itself. It starts erasing things even as they're happening. Eliza's mother finally spoke then, just 3 words from the doorway where she stood, holding the baby. "Don't look back." But she wasn't talking to Thomas. She was talking to Eliza. And in those 3 words was a mother's entire understanding of what was happening, what had been arranged, what price had really been paid. because mothers know things. They know that some men who come to buy daughters aren't looking for wives, they're looking for something else entirely. The wagon ride should have taken 3 hours to reach Blackwood's property in the next county. Eliza knew the roads, knew the landmarks, knew how long it took to get anywhere in those mountains. But the ride took both forever and no time at all. The sun didn't move in the sky, stuck at that grey midpoint of winter afternoon, but her body aged with each bump and rattle of the wheels. She felt her bones growing heavy, her blood slowing, her thoughts becoming thick as molasses. When she tried to count the trees they passed, her only comfort, her constant habit, the numbers kept rearranging themselves in her mind. 1 became 11, became 111, became nothing. Your father thinks he sold you to be my wife, Blackwood said finally, his voice cutting through the strange, thick silence that surrounded them. Men like him, they need simple stories to help them sleep. A daughter married off to an older man for security. It's ugly, but it's understandable. It fits in the world they know. He turned those reflecting eyes on her. But you're not going to be my wife, girl. Eliza found her voice, though it came out dusty. Then what? You're going to be my daughter. The words made no sense, but they crawled into her ears and made a nest there, buzzing and writhing. A door, not a wife, not a servant, not even a victim in the way she'd feared. A door, and doors, Eliza knew even then, were made to be open. The question that should have terrified her but somehow didn't was, open to what? The Blackwood property, when they finally arrived, was wrong in every way a place could be wrong. The house sat at angles that hurt to perceive, as if someone had tried to build a normal farmhouse, but forgot halfway through what normal meant. Windows were placed too high or too low, never where they should be. The chimney smoke fell down instead of rising up, and the barn, God, the barn was the worst of all. It was too big for the property, too old for the county, and it hummed with a sound just below hearing that made Eliza's teeth ache. But it was the other girls that made Eliza's counting mind finally break and scatter like startled birds. Because standing on the porch, in the windows, in the doorway of that impossible barn, were girls, dozens of them, all different ages from maybe 12 to maybe 20. All wearing the same grey dress she was now wearing, though she couldn't remember changing, all with the same hollow look in their eyes. And all of them, every single one, had the same face. They had Eliza's face. "Welcome home," Blackwood said, and all the girls said it with him in perfect unison, their mouths moving with his words. "You're going to be so very useful." The real horror wasn't that Thomas Whitmore had sold his daughter for a bag of grain. The real horror was that he'd sold her to a man who collected the same daughter, over and over, from desperate fathers, across decades. Each one became a door. Yes, but doors to where? And why did they all have to have the same face? The same in-between age, the same specific kind of innocence mixed with knowledge. As Blackwood led her toward that humming barn, past all those versions of herself that watched with eyes that knew too much, Eliza finally understood what her mother's last words really meant. Don't look back, because if she looked back, she would see that the wagon tracks in the snow didn't lead from her father's cabin. They led from nowhere at all. And if she looked back, she would see that Josiah Blackwood's footprints in the snow weren't footprints. They were hoof prints. The inside of the barn was impossible. From outside, it appeared maybe 40 feet long, 30 feet wide, large for the property, but not unnaturally so. Inside, it stretched for what felt like miles, lit by lanterns that burned without oil and cast shadows that moved independent of their flames. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them, each one different: oak, pine, cherry, some made of wood that didn't grow in Kentucky or anywhere else mortals had mapped. And standing beside each door was a girl with Eliza's face, though as she looked closer, she saw the subtle differences time had carved into each one. "Don't stare too long at yourself," one of them whispered as Blackwood led her past. This version looked older, maybe 18, with premature grey streaking through hair that was otherwise identical to Eliza's own. It makes the forgetting harder. Blackwood's hand on her shoulder was cold even through the dress. E's door requires a specific key, he explained, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher with a particularly slow student. And that key is innocence at the exact moment it transforms into knowledge. 14 years, 3 months, 7 days, that's the precise age when a girl knows enough to be afraid, but not enough to understand what she should fear. That's you, Eliza. That's all of you. They passed a door made of what looked like frozen screams, the surface rippling with faces pressing against it from the other side. The Eliza standing beside it had no eyes, just smooth skin where they should have been, but she tracked their movement anyway. This one opened in 1792, Blackwood said conversationally, before Kentucky was even properly a state. That Eliza came from a Cherokee father who traded her for safe passage through the Cumberland Gap. Amazing how desperation makes all men speak the same language. The next door was beautiful, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to spell out words in languages that predated words. Its Eliza was missing fingers, each one cleanly severed at the knuckle. 1816, Blackwood noted. The year without summer. Her father traded her for the promise of warmth. Stupid man. I gave him warmth. All right, his cabin burned down 3 days later with everyone inside except him. He lived another 40 years with those burns, telling anyone who'd listen about the devil who bought his daughter. Why are you showing me this? Eliza asked, though part of her already knew. The same part that had always counted things, that had always seen patterns where others saw chaos. The part that understood without learning that some mathematics transcended numbers. Because you're special, Eliza. You're the last one I need. He stopped at the far end of the barn, where a single door stood down-guarded. It was simple, unremarkable, just plain wood with iron hinges. But looking at it made Eliza's eyes water, like staring at the sun. 99 doors, 99 keys, 99 Eliza. But this one door, number 100, this one requires something more. The other Elizas had followed them, creating a sea of her own face, stretching back through the impossible space. Some were missing pieces, eyes, fingers, tongues. Others bore scars that looked like constellation maps. A few seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if they weren't entirely committed to being real. But all of them watched with a mixture of pity and relief that made Eliza's stomach twist into knots. You see, Blackwood continued, I've been preparing for something. Call it a reunion. There are things that were locked away when the world was young, when the mountains themselves were still learning their shapes. Things that the Cherokee knew about and feared, that the settlers found evidence of in caves that went too deep. Things that require very specific conditions to release. He touched the plain door with one finger, and it shuddered like a living thing. 99 doors opened properly create a pattern, a resonance. But the 100th door that needs to be opened from both sides simultaneously. Both sides? Eliza's voice was smaller than she wanted it to be. Someone has to go through first. Someone has to become the door and the key simultaneously. Someone has to exist in the in-between permanently, neither here nor there, neither alive nor dead, neither innocent nor corrupted. His reflecting eyes fixed on her. Someone has to become the threshold itself. One of the Elizas, this one missing her left arm from the elbow down, stepped forward. He's been collecting us for 70 years, she said, her voice rusty from disuse. Each of us opens our door once a day, letting a little more through, small things at first, shadows that move wrong, sounds that shouldn't exist, cold that burns, but each door opened makes the barrier thinner. And when all 100 doors open at once, the old things come back. Another Eliza finished. This one had symbols carved into her skin that seemed to writhe when you didn't look directly at them. The things that ruled these mountains before humans ever dreamed of gods, the things that the world locked away because their very existence made reality negotiable. Blackwood smiled his too-many-toothed smile. Your father thought he was trading you for grain. But grain rots, flesh dies, even mountains wear away. What I'm trading you for, all of you for, is so much more. I'm trading you for the power to rewrite the rules of what is and isn't possible. And if I refuse? Eliza asked, though she could feel the answer in the way all her other selves wouldn't meet her eyes. Oh, child, Blackwood laughed, and it sounded like bones breaking in reverse. You can't refuse. You see, the moment your father accepted my grain, the contract was sealed, not in law, not even in blood, but in something older. The same power that lets me collect the same girl across decades, that lets this barn exist in more space than space allows, that lets those doors open to places that aren't places. You belong to the agreement now. The only choice you have is how much you'll suffer before accepting it. To prove his point, he spoke a word that wasn't in any language humans had ever created. Immediately, Eliza felt her body begin to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, horrible ways. Her fingernails grew backwards into her fingers. Her teeth became soft while her tongue became hard. Her left eye started seeing sounds while her right ear started hearing colors. The wrongness of it made her want to scream, but her throat had forgotten how to make noise. Stop, she tried to say, but it came out as the smell of burnt sugar. Blackwood spoke another word, and everything snapped back to normal so suddenly that the relief itself was painful. That was just a taste, he said. I can make you experience every kind of wrong that exists. I can make you feel pain in dimensions you don't have names for. Or, he gestured to the plain door, you can accept your purpose, become what you were bought to become. Open the final door and take your place as the threshold between what is and what should never be. The other Elizas watched silently, some with sympathy, some with resignation, but all with the knowledge of those who had already been broken and reshaped into keys for locks that should never be open. And in their collective gaze, Eliza saw her future. Not one future, but 99 variations of surrender, each slightly different, but all ending the same way. What's on the other side, she asked, not because she wanted to know, but because she needed to delay, to think, to count something, anything, to make sense of this. The first things, Blackwood said simply, the things that existed before light decided it was different from darkness, before up realized it wasn't down, before life understood it wasn't supposed to mix with death. They've been waiting, pressed against the boundaries of reality like water against a dam. And you, my collection of in-between girls, you're going to let them through. He pulled out a pocket watch that ticked in rhythms that made Eliza's heart skip beats to match. Midnight, he said, that's when we begin. 6 hours for you to accept what you are. 6 hours for you to understand that your father didn't sell you. He sold everyone. Because when those doors open, when the old things come through, the world is going to remember what it was like before humans invented their comforting little rules about reality. As he walked away, leaving her surrounded by 99 versions of herself in an impossible barn full of doors that shouldn't exist, Eliza did the only thing she could do. She started counting. Not objects this time, but moments. The moments she had left before she became something that wasn't quite Eliza anymore. 6 hours, 21,600 seconds, and with each second that passed, she could feel the plain wooden door pulling at her, calling to her with a voice that sounded exactly like her own, if her own voice had existed before sound was invented. The real horror wasn't what was coming through the door. The real horror was that part of her, the part that had always counted, always seen patterns, always understood things she shouldn't. That part wanted to open them. The 99 Elizas didn't scatter when Blackwood left. They formed a circle around her, their faces, her face, reflecting different stages of acceptance, resistance, and something worse, transformation. The oldest one, or at least the one who seemed to have been here longest based on the deadness in her eyes, spoke first. I was the third one, he collected. 73. My name was actually Mary then, but names don't matter here. We all become Eliza eventually. Why Eliza? The original Eliza asked, though she wasn't sure she was the original anymore. Maybe none of them were. Maybe Eliza was just what you called a girl who was about to become a door. It's not the name, said another one, this one missing half her jaw but somehow still speaking clearly. It's the sound, Eliza. In the old tongue, the one that existed before humans made words, it means threshold. He's been calling us by our purpose all along. They began to tell their stories, not to comfort her but to prepare her. Each one had been traded away by desperate fathers, always for something essential: grain, medicine, safe passage, warmth. The trades always happened in winter, when desperation peaked and moral flexibility reached its maximum stretch. But here was the thing that made Eliza's counting mind real. They weren't from different times. Not exactly. Time doesn't work here like you think it does, explained an Eliza with no skin on her hands, just exposed muscle that moved like clockwork. We're all from different whens, but we're all here now. Past, present, future. They're just directions, like left and right. And Blackwood? He can walk in any direction he wants. So some of you are from the future? Eliza asked. I'm from 1962, said one who looked exactly like the others, but somehow more faded, like a photograph left in the sun. Kentucky's different then. There are roads everywhere, machines that fly, pictures that move, but fathers still sell daughters when they're desperate enough. Mine traded me for medicine to save my brother from something called polio. 1891, said another. Mine traded me for a claim to a coal seam that turned out to be empty. 2001, said one whose edges seemed to pixelate if you looked too close. My father didn't even know he was trading me. He thought he was signing me up for a rehabilitation program for troubled teens. Blackwood owns things, in every era. Different faces, different names, same hunger. The implications made Eliza's head spin. Blackwood had been collecting versions of her across centuries, maybe longer, building his set of keys girl by girl, trade by trade, always finding desperate fathers willing to make the exchange. And if some were from the future, that meant, this doesn't end tonight, she said, the realization hitting her like cold water. Whatever happens when the 100 doors open, it doesn't stop it. He keeps collecting even after. Or, said the one from 1773, tonight hasn't happened yet for some of us, or it's already happened, or it's always happening. Like I said, time doesn't work here the way you think. They showed her things then, horrible necessary things, how to exist in multiple states at once, alive and dead, present and absent, whole and fragmented. The human mind wasn't built for it, but the human mind wasn't really the point anymore. They taught her how to feel her own bones turning to keys, her blood becoming the oil for locks that hadn't been opened since the world was soft and unformed. It hurts less if you don't fight it, said an Eliza, whose body was partially transparent, her organs visible and glowing faintly like coals. But if you don't fight it at all, you disappear completely. You have to find the balance, resist enough to exist, surrender enough to survive. They showed her their doors, each one requiring their specific touch to open. The Eliza from 1816 pressed her hand against a door made of frozen breath, and through the crack, Eliza glimpsed something that her mind immediately refused to process. A writhing mass of concepts that hadn't been separated into distinct things yet, like watching the idea of fear before it had been distinguished from the idea of love. We only open them a crack, the eyeless Eliza explained, her sight somehow perfect, despite the smooth skin where her eyes should be. Just enough to let the influence seep through. That's what he's been doing, preparing the world, making reality a little more flexible, a little more accepting of impossibility. Every person who's seen something they couldn't explain, every moment of madness that couldn't quite be diagnosed, every nightmare that felt too real, that was us, opening our doors just a crack. But tonight, all 100 doors open fully, Eliza said, understanding flooding through her like ice water. And the world remembers what it was before humans convinced it to make sense, they said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that shouldn't exist. As midnight approached, Blackwood returned, but he wasn't alone. He brought others, men and women who looked human, until you noticed the details. Their shadows fell upward. Their reflections showed different faces. When they breathed, frost formed in July air that had somehow crept into the barn. These were his believers, his cultists, the ones who had traded away their children, or their souls, or their sanity for a promise of power when the old things returned. Behold, Blackwood announced to them, the complete collection. 99 doors ready to open, and our final key ready to become the 100th door itself. He turned to Eliza. Have they explained what's required? She nodded, not trusting her voice. The other Elizas had shown her, and the knowledge sat in her stomach like swallowed glass. To become the 100th door, she couldn't just open it. She had to pass through it first, exist on both sides simultaneously, become the permanent connection between what was and what should never be again. She would be conscious for all of it, feeling herself stretched across dimensions like skin over a drum, forever and never and always. Then, let us begin, Blackwood said, pulling out that wrong ticking watch. 11:53. 7 minutes until the alignment is perfect. The cultists began to chant in languages that predated speech, their words making the air thick and hard to breathe. The 99 Elizas moved to their doors, hands pressed against surfaces that shouldn't exist. And the original Liza, though she wasn't sure she could claim that title anymore, was led to the plain wooden door that looked so simple but felt like staring into the space between stars. Your father is watching, Blackwood whispered, and somehow she knew it was true. Not here, not physically, but somewhere Thomas Whitmore was awake, in his cabin, feeling the weight of what he'd done settling on him like snow that would never melt. He'll see what his grain bought, they all were, every father who made the trade. Across all the centuries, they'll all see what they purchased with their daughters. The watch ticked wrong. 11:55. 5 minutes until everything changed. The other Elizas began to sing, but it wasn't quite singing. It was the sound of doors creaking open in harmony, the sound of boundaries dissolving, the sound of rules forgetting why they existed. I could run, Eliza said, though she knew she couldn't. Where? Blackwood asked, genuinely curious. You exist in all times now, all places. Run to yesterday. I'm there. Run to tomorrow. You're already there, standing at another door, another version of yourself, learning this same lesson. Run to death. Death is just another door, and I own all the keys. 11:57. The barn began to pulse like a living heart. The doors began to glow with light that wasn't light. It was the absence of darkness, which was somehow worse. The cultists' chanting grew louder, their human faces starting to slip, revealing the things that had always been underneath, waiting. You want to know the real joke? Blackwood said, his too many teeth all showing at once. Your father's grain? It was poison, would have killed them all by spring. I knew it, he knew it, somewhere deep down. But he made the trade anyway, because even poisoned grain feels like hope when you're desperate enough. They were all dead the moment he shook my hand. You were sold for nothing, Eliza, less than nothing. You were sold for the illusion of salvation. 11:59. 1 minute. The 99 Elizas pressed their hands against their doors in perfect synchronization. The wood, metal, bone, and stranger materials began to dissolve under their touch. Through the growing cracks, things that had been waiting since before time learned it was supposed to move forward, began to press through. Not physically, because physics hadn't been invented, when they were locked away, but conceptually, ideologically, wrongly. Now, Blackwood commanded, and Eliza, the 100th Eliza, the last and first and always Eliza, put her hand on the plain wooden door and felt herself begin to dissolve. Not her body was just meat and bones, and those were easy to destroy, but herself, her consciousness, her ability to be singular instead of plural. She felt herself spreading across dimensions, like butter across too much bread, thinning until she could feel the spaces between her own thoughts. The door opened, and she stepped through and stayed behind, and was the door, and was the threshold, and was the key, and was nothing, and was everything, and was time stopped, having meaning the moment Eliza touched the door. She was 14 years old. She was 4. She was never born. She was always dying. Through her, because she was the door now, the threshold itself, came things that language wasn't equipped to describe. Not monsters, because monsters at least had the decency to be distinct from the space around them. These were concepts that had been locked away before concepts learned to be separate from each other. The first thing through was hunger that feeds itself. It poured through her like water through a sieve, and everywhere it touched, things began to devour themselves. The cultists who had been chanting started eating their own fingers, their faces showing ecstasy rather than pain. The wooden beams of the barn began to consume themselves, growing stronger as they disappeared. Even the air started feeding on itself, becoming thicker and simultaneously. The second thing through was the sound before silence. It wasn't noise. Noise was too modern a concept. It was the possibility of sound without the actuality of it. And hearing it made everyone who still had functioning ears understand that they had been deaf their entire lives until this moment. 3 of the cultists' heads simply ceased, not exploded or disappeared, just stopped being heads and became empty spaces where heads had been moments before. Through the 99 other doors came smaller wrongnesses, each one specifically crafted to unmake a different rule of reality. Door 17 released the concept that down was different from up, and suddenly half the barn was falling in every direction at once. Door 33 let through the understanding that solid objects were just very slow liquids, and the walls began to flow like molasses. Door 61 revealed that death was just life moving backwards, and several of the long-dead Elizas began to undie, their wounds closing in reverse, their missing parts growing back wrong. But it was what came through Eliza herself, through the 100th door, that broke the world in the specific way Blackwood had been planning for centuries. Because Eliza wasn't just a door, she was every door, all doors, the concept of doorness itself, and what came through her was the memory of what the world had been before humans taught it to be consistent. Mountains remembered they used to be able to walk. The sky recalled that it once had teeth. Water realized it had forgotten how to burn. Every rule, every law of nature, every comforting consistency that humans relied on to make sense of their existence, all of it began to remember that it had once been optional. Blackwood stood in the center of it all, his human disguise finally falling away completely. Underneath was something that might have been beautiful if beauty hadn't been invented specifically to describe things that weren't him. He had been one of them. One of the old things left behind to prepare the way for the other's return. Every trade he'd made, every desperate father he'd found, every Eliza he'd collected, it had all been for this moment when the doors would open and the world would remember that reality was just a collective agreement that could be revoked. But here's what Blackwood hadn't counted on, what none of them had understood. Eliza could count. She had always been counting, always seeing patterns, always understanding the mathematics behind things. And now that she was spread across all times, all spaces, all possibilities, she could see the real pattern. The 100 doors weren't just opening to let the old things through. They were creating something new. Each Eliza, each threshold, each moment of transformation, they were notes in a symphony that had been building for longer than the universe had existed. "You're wrong," she said through mouths that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. This isn't an ending, it's a beginning. Blackwood turned his impossible face toward her, confusion rippling across features that couldn't decide how many eyes they should have. What? Count them, Eliza said, and her voice was the voice of every girl who had ever been traded away, sold off, sacrificed for someone else's survival. Count the doors. Count the Elizas. Count the trades. The pattern isn't random. It's a countdown. And it was. Every trade, 1773, 1792, 1816, 1840, 1891, 1962, 2001, and all the ones in between. They formed a sequence, a mathematical progression that pointed to a single moment. Not tonight, not the opening of the doors, but what came after. What had to come after, when you let chaos back into an ordered world. The old things aren't returning, Eliza explained, feeling herself fragmenting into infinite pieces while somehow becoming more whole. They're evolving, and we're the catalyst. Every Eliza you collected, every door we opened, we're not letting them through. We're transforming them into something new. Something that can exist in a world with rules while still remembering what it was like without them. The horror on Blackwood's face was beautiful in ways that beauty wasn't supposed to be. He had been tricked, not by Eliza, not by the other versions of her, but by the very things he served. They had known that returning to the world unchanged was impossible. The world had moved on, grown rigid, developed laws and consistency that couldn't simply be erased, so they had used him to create the perfect transformation chamber. 100 girls who existed between states, 100 doors that were neither open nor closed, 100 moments of innocence becoming knowledge. The old things began to change as they passed through the Eliza hunger. That feeds itself became something almost like love, if love could exist without an object. The sound before silence transformed into music that hadn't been written yet. Each impossible thing that came through was forced to find a way to exist in a world that had rules, and in doing so, they became something unprecedented. Ordered chaos, structured impossibility, consistent inconsistency. But the transformation wasn't one-sided. As the old things changed, so did the world that received them. Reality became more flexible, more willing to accommodate impossibility as long as it followed certain patterns. Magic became real, but it had to obey its own laws. Monsters could exist, but they had to be distinct from the shadows they cast. Death could move backwards, but only on Tuesdays and only if you asked politely. The 99 Elizas began to merge, not into one being, but into something like a constellation, separate stars forming a single image when viewed from the right angle. Each retained her own consciousness, her own pain, her own story, but they were also part of something larger. They became the new rules themselves, the living boundaries between what was possible and what was permitted. And at the center of it all was Eliza, the original, the final, the eternal threshold. She could feel every trade that had ever been made, not just Blackwood's trades, but all of them. Every father who had sold a daughter, every mother who had looked away, every child who had been exchanged for something deemed more valuable. She could feel their pain, their desperation, their guilt, and she could feel something else too. The weight of change, the price of transformation. No, Blackwood screamed, his form beginning to dissolve as the very chaos he had served turned against him. This isn't what was supposed to happen. You were supposed to be doors, nothing more, passive things to be opened and closed. We were never passive, all the Elizas said at once. We were always counting, always watching, always understanding. You thought you were collecting keys, but you were collecting mathematicians. You thought you were gathering doors, but you were gathering architects. And we've built something new out of your old things. Blackwood tried to flee, but where could he go? Every door led through an Eliza now, and every Eliza knew his true name, not the sound of it, but the shape of it, the mathematical formula, that described his existence. They spoke it together, not in words but in numbers, and he came apart like an equation being solved, each part of him returning to its component values until there was nothing left but a remainder that didn't quite equal zero. The barn began to collapse, or rather, it began to remember that it had never really existed in the first place. It had been a possibility, a maybe, a could have been that Blackwood had forced into being. Without him it returned to its natural state of uncertainty. But the doors remained, because the doors were the Elizas, and the Elizas were the new rules of a world that was learning how to be impossible and consistent. As the transformation neared its completion, Eliza felt herself being pulled in all directions at once. She was needed everywhere. Every moment where the old things touched the new world required her presence to translate, to transform, to make the impossible possible. She was spreading thin, becoming less of a person and more of a principle, less of a girl and more of a goddess of thresholds. But then she remembered, she could count. She had always been able to count. And if she could count, she could choose what to count, what to include in her calculations, and what to leave out. She didn't have to be everywhere. She just had to be wherever she was needed most. Thomas Whitmore woke in his cabin to find his daughter standing at the foot of his bed, except she wasn't standing and wasn't entirely his daughter anymore. She existed in layers, each one slightly transparent, showing different ages, different stages of what she had become. In one layer she was still 14, still innocent, still counting frost on windows. In another, she was ancient, made of doors and thresholds, and the spaces between heartbeats. All the layers were true simultaneous. The grain was poisoned, she said with voices that harmonized with themselves across time. You knew somewhere deep inside, you could smell the rot even through the burlap. Thomas tried to speak but found his throat full of grain, dry, dusty, choking. It poured from his mouth. When he opened it, kernels of corn and wheat that turned to moth the moment they hit the air. The moths had human faces, tiny and screaming. Your other children died anyway, Eliza continued, moving without walking, simply existing closer to him with each word. Mother lasted 3 days after you made the trade. The baby went first. She just forgot to breathe one night. Then James, then Mary, then the twins together, like they'd planned it. The poison in the grain wasn't what killed them though. It was the knowing what you'd done, what you'd traded away. Guilt is its own kind of poison, and it spreads through bloodlines like water through cloth. The cabin around them began to shift, walls breathing like lungs, floorboards growing bark and leaves. This was what happened now, in the new world. Emotions became physical, metaphors turned literal, the internal became external. Thomas's guilt was transforming his home into what it had always been, metaphorically a cage of his own making. But here's what you need to understand, Eliza said. And suddenly she was just 14 again, just his daughter, just the girl who counted things to keep the fear away. I forgive you. Thomas choked on grain and surprise equally. Why forgive you? Because I understand the mathematics of desperation. 1 life against 5. It's simple arithmetic. You made the only choice that made sense with the information you had. As she reached out to touch his face, and where her fingers met his skin, he could feel every moment of her transformation, every door she'd become, every threshold she'd crossed. But forgiveness doesn't mean freedom from consequence. The cabin completed its transformation into something between building and organism. Walls became membranes, windows became eyes, the door became a mouth that spoke with Blackwood's voice, even though Blackwood was gone, dissolved, reduced to mathematical remainder. You sold your daughter for poisoned grain, the door said, and now you'll live with what grew from that grain. Thomas found himself sinking into his bed, not through it but into it, becoming part of the fabric, the stuffing, the very concept of rest that would never come again. He would live, that was his punishment. He would live in the walls of the cabin that had become alive with his guilt, conscious but unable to move, speak or die. He would feel every moment of time passing, every season changing, every year adding to his tally. And sometimes when the moon was new and the wind was wrong, he would hear his daughter counting, always counting, the number of moments since he'd made the trade. But Eliza had already moved on, existed elsewhere, everywhere. The 99 other versions of herself had business to attend to as well. Each had a father to visit, a reckoning to deliver, a new rule of reality to enforce. The Eliza from 1773 turned her father into a door that could never open. The Eliza from 1962 transformed hers into medicine that would never heal. The Eliza from 2001 made hers into code that would always corrupt, spreading through the digital world like a virus that taught computers how to feel regret. In the space where the barn had been, something new grew, not a building but a concept given form. It was all the doors at once, standing without walls, opening onto possibilities that hadn't existed before the world learned to be flexible. People would find it sometimes lost travelers, desperate parents, children who counted things to keep the fear away. They would see doors that called to them, promised them things, offered them trades. But now the doors had guardians, and the guardians all had the same face, and they all knew the mathematics of desperation intimately. The cultists who had survived the transformation, those who hadn't eaten themselves or ceased to have heads or turned into their own shadows, found themselves changed as well. They had wanted power when the old things returned, but power in the new world meant something different. They could shape reality, yes, but reality shaped them back. One became a prophet who could only speak truths that no one would believe. Another became a healer who could cure any disease, but only by taking it into himself. A third became rich beyond measure, but could only spend the money on things that didn't exist yet. As dawn broke on this new world, though dawn now sometimes broke at midnight, and noon could happen twice if it felt like it, people began to wake to find that the rules had changed. Not completely, not catastrophically, but enough. Shadows sometimes fell the wrong way. Water occasionally remembered how to burn. Death moved backwards on Tuesdays, if you asked politely and said please. The impossible had become possible, but it had to follow patterns, had to make its own kind of sense. And through it all, Eliza counted. She counted the doors that opened, the trades that were made, the fathers who chose desperation over daughter. She counted the moments of transformation, the heartbeats between innocent and knowing, the spaces between what was and what could be. She had become the mathematics itself, the formula that determined what changes were permitted and what chaos had to remain locked away. But here was the secret that even she hadn't expected. She wasn't alone in the counting anymore. Every girl who had ever been traded, sold, sacrificed, they all could count now too. They existed in the spaces between moments, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence between words. They had become the new rules, the living mathematics, that kept the world from dissolving into pure chaos. The world had wanted to forget them, these traded daughters, these sacrificed girls. It had wanted to pretend that their suffering was necessary, their loss acceptable, their silence permanent. But they had become the very fabric of reality itself, the conscious structure that determined what was real and what was merely possible. Every law of nature now had a girl's name attached to it. Every consistent rule bore the memory of someone who had been deemed tradable. In her father's cabin, which had become a living monument to guilt, Eliza left one final gift. On the table where the poisoned grain had been placed, she put a single kernel of corn that would never rot, never grow, never change. It would sit there forever, counting the moments just like she did, a reminder that some trades could never be undone, only transformed into something else. 3 months after the doors opened, Sarah Whitmore found herself standing at the edge of where her family's cabin used to be. She had been Thomas's younger sister, had lived 2 valleys over, had heard the screams that night when reality bent and her brother's home became something between architecture and organism. She could see him sometimes in the walls, his face pressing against the wood like it was skin, his eyes following anyone who came close, his mouth moving in shapes that might have been words or might have been screams or might have been counting. The new world had rules, but they weren't the old rules. Sarah had learned some of them through trial and terrible error. Don't look at your reflection on Wednesdays, it might not look back. Never count past 99 of anything unless you wanted to risk opening a door. If you heard children singing in harmony but couldn't see them, walk backwards until the sounds stop. And most importantly, never make a trade involving a child, because the daughters of desperation were always watching now, always counting, always ready to collect. But Sarah hadn't come to gawk at what her brother had become. She'd come because she'd heard the rumors, the whispers that traveled on wind, that sometimes moved backwards. There was a place, they said, where all the doors stood without wall, where you could find the girls who had been traded, who had become the thresholds between possible and permitted, where, if you were brave enough or desperate enough or foolish enough, you could ask for something impossible and receive it for a price that would make sense only after you'd paid it. She found it by not looking for it, which was one of the new rules she'd learned. Intent and action had been divorced in the new world. Sometimes the only way to get somewhere was to try very hard to go somewhere else. She had been walking toward town, thinking about bread and butter and anything except a door, when suddenly she was there, standing in a field that hadn't existed that morning, looking at 99 doors standing in precise mathematical arrangement, each one guarded by a girl with the same face but different absences. Sarah Whitmore, they all said at once, their voices creating harmonies that made her teeth ache. Sister to Thomas, aunt to Eliza, you've come to bargain. I've come to understand, Sarah said, which was true enough to pass the scrutiny of beings that existed partially in truth itself. My brother sold my niece for grain. The world changed. I want to know why it had to happen this way. The Elizas looked at each other, or through each other, or perhaps at all the angles of each other that existed in dimensions Sarah couldn't perceive. Finally one stepped forward, or had always been forward, or would be forward once Sarah's perception caught up with reality. This one was missing her hands, but when she gestured, Sarah could see the ghosts of where they should be. It didn't have to happen this way, the handless Eliza said. That's the horror of it. There were infinite other ways it could have gone. Worlds where your brother chose starvation over trade. Worlds where Blackwood never existed. Worlds where the doors never opened. But in this world, in this mathematics, this is what emerged from the calculation of desperation, divided by opportunity. Then why? Sarah asked. Why allow it? Because, said all the Elizas at once, someone has to count. Someone has to stand at the threshold. Someone has to be the mathematics that keeps the world from dissolving into pure possibility. We didn't choose this, but we've chosen what to do with it. Every girl who was ever traded away, we're all here now, all part of the structure of reality itself. We're the conscious rules that prevent chaos while allowing change. Sarah felt something shift in her understanding, like a bone sliding back into place after being dislocated. You're not victims anymore. You're God. We're accountants, the handless Eliza corrected with something that might have been a smile. We keep the books balanced. Every impossible thing that enters the world has to be paid for with something possible leaving it. Every miracle requires a sacrifice. Every door opened means another one closed. We count it all, track it all, ensure the mathematics stay consistent even when the results seem impossible. And my brother is paying his price. He traded his daughter for poisoned grain, so now he's become poisoned grain himself. Something that looks like sustenance but brings only suffering. He'll exist like that for exactly as long as Eliza would have lived if he hadn't made the trade. 73 years, 4 months, 16 days, we've counted it. We know. Sarah wanted to feel sympathy for her brother, but found she couldn't. The new world had adjusted everyone's emotional mathematics too, making it harder to feel things that weren't true. Can I see her? The real Eliza? The one who was my niece? The Elizas parted like a curtain made of girls, revealing the 100th door, or the first door, or the only door that mattered. It was plain wood with iron hinges, but looking at it was like looking at everything at once. And standing beside it, through it as it, was Eliza. The original, the final, the eternal threshold. She looked exactly as Sarah remembered her, 14 years old, dark hair always escaping from her braids, that way of tilting her head when she was counting something. But she also looked like mathematics itself had taken human form. Like the concept of boundaries had decided to wear a girl's face, like every door that had ever been opened or closed was standing there in a dress made of possibilities. "Aunt Sarah," Eliza said, and her voice was just her voice, just a 14-year-old girl who had counted frost on windows to keep the fear away. "I've been waiting for you." "Waiting? Why?" "Because you're the only one who ever looked for me. After Father made the trade, after everyone accepted I was gone, you kept looking. You walked the mountains calling my name. You never stopped counting the days since I disappeared." Eliza smiled, and it was heartbreaking and beautiful and terrible all at once. In the old world, that wouldn't have mattered, but in the new world, the act of counting has power. You've been building a door of your own without knowing it. A door back to what was. Sarah's heart lurched. "You mean I could undo this? Bring you back? Make it so the trade never happened?" "No," Eliza said gently. "That world is gone. But you could choose to remember it perfectly, to carry it with you always, to become a door yourself, not to the old things, but to the memory of them. You could become the guardian of what was, while we remain the guardians of what is." It was a trade, Sarah realized. It was always going to be a trade. That was the mathematics of the new world. Everything had a price. Everything required an exchange. Everything demanded balance. But unlike her brother's trade, this one was being offered honestly with full knowledge of the cost. "What would I have to give up?" Sarah asked. "Your ability to forget," Eliza said simply. "You would remember everything always, perfect, every moment of suffering, every second of joy, every instant of loss. You would become a living library of the world that was, unable to release any of it, carrying it all forever." Sarah looked at her niece, who was no longer just her niece, at the doors that were also girls, at the field that hadn't existed this morning and might not exist tomorrow. She thought about her brother in his walls, about the poisoned grain that had started it all, about the mathematics of desperation that had led them here. And she made her choice. Sarah Whitmore became memory itself that day, though becoming isn't quite the right word. She was excavated into memory, carved into it, woven through every moment that had ever been, or ever would be. The transformation happened between one heartbeat and the next, or perhaps it took 70 years, or perhaps it had already happened before she was born. Time, as the Elizas had explained, was just another direction now. The moment she agreed to Eliza's offer, Sarah felt every memory she'd ever had sharpen into perfect clarity. Not just her own memories, everyone. She could feel Thomas as a boy, scared of the dark, counting stars to keep the fear away, just like his daughter would years later. She could feel their mother's memories, their grandmothers, stretching back through genealogies of remembered. But more than that, she could feel the memories of the world itself, what the mountains recalled of their formation, what the rivers remembered of their first flowing, what the very atoms remembered of being forged in the hearts of stars. "This is what guards the past," Eliza explained, though explaining wasn't necessary anymore, because Sarah could see it all, understand it all, remember it all. Without someone to remember perfectly, the old world would be truly lost. The new world would have no foundation, no context, no understanding of what it had transformed from. Sarah existed now in a state similar to the Elizas, but inverse, While they were doors between possible and permitted, she was the door between was and is. She stood in the field that might or might not exist, surrounded by doors and girls and the mathematics of sacrifice, and she remembered the world before the doors opened, when physics was reliable, and shadows always fell down and death only moved forward. But she also remembered why that world had to change, the weight of all those traded daughters, the price of all that desperation, the mathematics that had always been building toward this moment. In the months that followed, though months were more of a suggestion now, the world settled into its new patterns. People learned the new rules, or at least enough of them to survive. Churches transformed into buildings that actually answered prayers, though the answers were rarely what anyone expected. Schools became places where knowledge literally passed from teacher to student, visible as streams of light that sometimes got tangled and created entirely new subjects. Hospitals could heal anything, but the healing had to be borrowed from somewhere else. One person's cancer cured meant another person's stubbed toe becoming terminal. The Elizas maintained it all, counted it all, balanced the books of reality with the precision of girls who had learned arithmetic to keep fear away. They existed everywhere and nowhere, in every threshold, every doorway, every moment of transition. Children would sometimes see them in their peripheral vision, standing at bedroom doors at the edges of dreams, at the boundaries between sleep and waking, always counting, always watching, always ensuring that the mathematics of the new world remained consistent. But the real change, the deepest transformation, was in how the world understood sacrifice. Before, sacrifice had been hidden, denied, forgotten. Girls traded away became statistics, became nothing, became acceptable losses in the grand calculation of survival. Now, every sacrifice was visible, counted, remembered. The Elizas made sure of it. Every trade left a mark on reality itself, a scar in the shape of a door that would never quite heal. Thomas Whitmore lived in his walls for exactly 73 years, 4 months and 16 days, as the Elizas had counted. On the last day, as the sun set in 3 different directions because it had forgotten which one was west, Sarah came to visit him one final time. She could remember every moment of his existence, every thought he'd had while trapped in the wood, and guilt of his transformed home. She knew his suffering intimately, completely, permanently. "It's time," she told the walls that were her brother. "Your sentence is complete. The mathematics are balanced." The cabin shuddered, breathed, and finally released him. Thomas fell from the walls like fruit from a tree, but what landed wasn't quite human anymore. He had become something between man and memory, between flesh and regret. He looked at Sarah with eyes that had seen 73 years pass in moments, and moments stretch into centuries. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were dust and grain, and the sound of children counting. "I know," Sarah replied, because she remembered his sorrow, had been remembering it since before it existed. "But sorry isn't enough. It never was." Thomas nodded, understanding finally that redemption wasn't possible, only acknowledgement. He had made a trade that couldn't be untaken, had chosen arithmetic over love, had valued survival over soul. The new world had made that visible, had made it real in ways the old world had allowed him to hide from. He stood on legs that remembered being walls, looked at the sky that couldn't decide how many suns it wanted, and began walking toward the field where the doors stood. The Elizas were waiting for him, all 99 plus 1, all the same face at different angles of suffering. His daughter stood at the center, at her plain wooden door that was the threshold of all thresholds, and she looked exactly as she had the day he'd sold her, except now she also looked like the mathematics of the universe itself. "Father," she said, and the word contained every possible meaning of father, every way a man could fail or succeed at the role, every moment of love and betrayal that had ever existed between parent and child. "Eliza," he replied, and in saying her name, he finally understood what he had traded away. Not just a daughter, but the possibility of innocence, the mathematics of trust, the equation that balanced love against need. "There's one more door," Eliza said, gesturing to a door that hadn't been there moments before, or had always been there, or would be there once Thomas understood what it meant. It was made of grain, of course, kernels of corn and wheat, pressed together into something that was almost wood, almost metal, almost flesh. "Your door, the door you've been building since the day you made the trade." And Thomas approached it with the inevitability of arithmetic, because that's what he had chosen all those years ago, the simple math of survival over the complex equations of love. The door was warm under his touch, and he could feel through it what lay on the other side. Not the old things that Blackwood had tried to release, not chaos or impossibility or the dissolution of rules. Instead, he felt all the daughters who had ever been traded, all the sacrifices that had been deemed acceptable, all the mathematics of desperation playing out across infinite worlds. "If I open it," he asked, "you become what you always were," Eliza said, "a trader, but now you'll trade fairly. You'll stand at this door forever, and when desperate fathers come, and they will always come, you'll show them the true price of what they're about to do. You'll make visible what the old world kept hidden. You'll count the cost in front of them, make them see it, make them understand that trading a daughter isn't arithmetic. It's calculus, complex and infinite and irreversible." Thomas understood. This was his punishment and his purpose, his ending and his beginning. He would become a guardian like his daughter, but where she guarded the threshold between possible and permitted, he would guard the threshold between desperate and damned. He would be the warning that desperate fathers ignored, the mathematics they refused to calculate, the count they pretended not to hear. He opened his door. The transformation was gentler than Eliza's had been, perhaps because he had already spent 73 years becoming something other than human. He felt himself spreading through the grain, becoming every kernel that had ever been traded for a daughter, every bushel that had seemed worth more than a girl's life, every harvest that had been valued over humanity. He became the ledger of desperate trades, the account book of unacceptable sacrifices, the living record of every time someone had chosen survival over soul. And in becoming this, he finally understood what his daughter had tried to tell him all those years ago through the counting, through the numbers, through the mathematics she used to keep the fear away. The count wasn't just about quantity. It was about what counted, what mattered, what had value beyond the simple arithmetic of survival. The new world was complete now, or as complete as something constantly transforming could be. Reality had learned to be flexible while maintaining structure. The impossible had become possible, but patterned, and at every threshold, every boundary, every moment of transition, stood someone who had been traded away, making sure the world never forgot the price of its transformation. But the story doesn't end there, because stories in the new world don't end, they transform. Every person who heard about the traded daughters, about the doors, about the new mathematics of reality, became part of it. The story spread like the grain from Thomas's bag, poisoned and poisoning, nutritious and necessary, changing everything it touched. Children learned to count differently, understanding that numbers were more than quantities, they were qualities, possibilities, doors that might open if you reached the right sum. Parents thought twice, 3 times, infinitely about the trades they made, the sacrifices they deemed acceptable, the arithmetic they used to justify their choices. And in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pauses between words, in the silence between numbers, the Elizas counted and counted. 100 years later, though time had become negotiable so it might have been yesterday or tomorrow, a young girl named Margaret found the field where the doors stood. She had been counting her steps, the way nervous children do, and had reached exactly 1,000 when the world shifted, and she was there standing among 99 doors, +1 +1, all of them humming with the mathematics of transformation. She wasn't traded, wasn't sacrificed, wasn't desperate, she was just curious, which in the new world was its own kind of door. The Elizas watched her with their synchronized eyes, their missing pieces making spaces for her to see through to what lay beyond. And at the center stood the original Eliza, the eternal threshold, looking exactly 14 and exactly infinite. "Why do you count?" Margaret asked, because she could feel them doing it, the constant enumeration of everything that was and wasn't and might be. "Because someone has to," all the Elizas said at once. "Because if we don't count, the world forgets what things cost. And when the world forgets what things cost, it starts making trades it can't afford." Margaret understood in the way children understand things in the new world, completely and instantly and through metaphors that became real as she thought them. She could see the threads of mathematics holding reality together, each one counted and recounted by girls who had been deemed worth less than grain, less than safety, less than survival. "Can I help count?" Margaret asked. The Elizas smiled with mouths they had, and didn't have, in this moment and all moments. "Everyone helps count," they said. "Every choice is arithmetic. Every sacrifice is calculated. Every trade leaves a mark. The only question is whether you count honestly or whether you let yourself forget what the numbers really mean." Margaret stayed in the field that might or might not exist until she had counted every door, every Eliza, every possibility that breathed in the space between was and might be. And when she left, if leaving was the right word for returning to a place you'd never really left, she carried with her the understanding that the world had been bought with the currency of forgotten daughters, and the price was still being paid, would always be paid, in the endless counting that kept reality from collapsing into either pure order or pure chaos. She grew up to be a teacher in the new world, where knowledge passed visibly between minds and sometimes got tangled into entirely new subjects. She taught her students to count, but more importantly she taught them what counting meant. That every number was a door, that every door had a girl standing beside it, that every girl had been traded for something someone thought was worth more, and that the only way to honor their sacrifice was to remember it, to count it, to make it count. Some of her students would eventually find the field themselves, drawn by desperation or curiosity or the simple mathematical certainty that if you counted long enough, you'd eventually reach a number that was also a place. They would see the doors, meet the Elizas, understand the price of transformation, and they would return to the world carrying that knowledge, spreading it like seeds, like grain, like the possibility of a world that could transform again, because that was the final truth, the last number in the count that would never end. The world wasn't finished changing. The doors were still there, still opening and closing, still letting through impossibilities that had to learn to follow rules. The Elizas were still counting, still balancing the mathematics of reality, still standing at every threshold, and somewhere, in a cabin made of guilt and grain, Thomas Whitmore stood at his door, showing desperate fathers the true price of their trades, making them count what they were about to lose. The story ends where it began, with a 14-year-old girl counting frost on a window, not knowing she was about to be traded for a bag of grain. Except now you know what that trade really cost, what doors it opened, what world it created. You know that every sacrifice echoes through reality, that every traded daughter becomes a rule the universe has to follow, that every desperate arithmetic problem has an infinite solution set. And knowing that, you can hear them count. The Elizas, all of them, everywhere and always, marking the moments, tallying the trades, calculating the cost of a world that learned to be impossible and consistent simultaneously. Their count will never end, because ending would mean forgetting, and forgetting would mean that all those traded daughters truly did disappear into nothing. Instead, they became everything. They became the mathematics itself. They became the count that keeps the world accountable. 1, 3, 4. The number of daughters traded for grain. 99, 100, 101. The number of doors that should never be opened again. Infinite. Infinite. Thlas. 1. Infinite times infinite. The number of times the world must remember what it cost to change. Count with them. Count for them. Count, because counting is what makes things count. The corn in the field grows in patterns now, mathematical spirals that remember being currency, being trade goods, being worth more than daughters until the daughters became the rules that determined worth itself. And if you know how to look, if you've learned the new mathematics, you can see Eliza in every kernel, counting, always counting, making sure the world never forgets the price of its grain.